Picture this. A quiet English teacher standing frozen in complete humiliation as teenage bullies lift her dress in front of an entire classroom, their cruel laughter echoing off the walls while she trembles in shame. But what these arrogant students didn't know was that their soft-spoken target had once been known by a very different name in competition. Rings across 3 states. They had no idea that the woman they were tormenting had earned the nickname Lightning Sarah for her devastating speed and precision. They couldn't have imagined that their gentle teacher had retired undefeated after accidentally putting her last opponent in the hospital. This is the raw, powerful story of Sarah Collins, a woman who buried her warrior spirit so deep that even she forgot it existed, until one moment of cruelty awakened something that would change everything. It's a tale that will make you question everything you think you know about quiet strength, hidden power, and the dangerous mistake of underestimating someone based on appearances alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Collins moved through the hallways of Riverside High School like a whisper, her soft-soled flats making barely a sound against the polished linoleum floors. At 28, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that often went unnoticed. In a world obsessed with bold statements and loud personalities, her auburn hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her wardrobe consisted entirely of modest cardigans, knee-length skirts, and comfortable flats that allowed her to navigate her classroom without drawing attention to herself. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, her green eyes held a gentleness that made struggling students feel safe to ask questions. But there was something else there too, something deeper that she kept carefully hidden. The small town of Millbrook, Ohio, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. Nestled 30 minutes outside Columbus, the community of 15,000 people prided itself on Friday night football games, church potlucks, and the sort of neighborly familiarity that could feel either comforting or suffocating depending on your perspective. Riverside High School sat at the heart of this community like a red brick monument to small-town values. Its 800 students representing the children of farmers, factory workers, and suburban families who had chosen the slower pace of rural life over the chaos of the city. Sarah had been teaching English at Riverside for 3 years now, and in that time, she had perfected the art of professional invisibility. She arrived early, stayed late, and conducted her classes with a quiet competence that earned her decent evaluations but little recognition. Her classroom, room 204, was a sanctuary of sorts, decorated with inspirational quotes about literature and learning. The walls lined with student projects and book displays that she arranged with meticulous care. She had created a space where even the most reluctant readers felt comfortable exploring new worlds through words, though she herself remained something of a mystery to both her colleagues and students. The only person who seemed to see past Sarah's carefully constructed facade was Mike Rodriguez, the paid teacher whose classroom was just down the hall from hers. Mike was everything Sarah appeared not to be: loud, confident, and always ready with a joke or an encouraging word. His booming laugh could be heard from 3 classrooms away, and his genuine enthusiasm for both sports and his students made him one of the most popular teachers in the building. Despite their apparent differences, Mike had taken Sarah under his wing from her first day at Riverside, sensing something in her quiet demeanor that reminded him of the shy kids he'd spent his career encouraging to find their courage. What none of them knew, what Sarah had spent the last 6 years of her life ensuring no one would ever discover, was that their mild-mannered English teacher had once been one of the most feared competitors in the Midwest karate circuit. Hidden away in the back of her bedroom closet, wrapped in old blankets and pushed behind winter coats she rarely wore, sat a collection of trophies and medals that told a very different story about Sarah Collins. State championships, regional tournaments, national rankings, all accumulated during a decade-long career, that had ended abruptly when she was 22 years old. The newspapers had called her Lightning Sarah for her incredible speed and the precision of her strikes. Her sensei, David Park, had been grooming her for international competition when everything changed in a single devastating moment. The accident, though it had been ruled exactly that by officials and witnesses, had haunted Sarah every day since. Her opponent, a skilled fighter named Jessica Martinez, had been advancing for what should have been a routine point-scoring technique, when Sarah's defensive counter had connected with unexpected force. The sound of Jessica's ribs cracking had echoed through the silent arena like gunshots, and the sight of her crumpling to the mat had burned itself into Sarah's memory with photographic clarity. Jessica had spent 2 weeks in the hospital and made a full recovery, even returning to competition 6 months later. But for Sarah, that moment had shattered something fundamental about who she thought she was. She had walked away from karate that very night, ignoring her sense's pleas and her mother's concerns about giving up something that had defined her entire identity since childhood. The trophies went into storage, the training gear was donated to the local youth center, and Sarah Collins the warrior became Sarah Collins the teacher, dedicating herself to nurturing minds instead of honing her body into a weapon. She had convinced herself that this quieter life was what she wanted, that helping teenagers discover the power of literature was a more meaningful way to spend her days than perfecting techniques designed to disable opponents. Her mother, Linda Collins, worried constantly about the dramatic change in her daughter's personality. The confident, fierce young woman who had once commanded respect in dojos across 3 states had been replaced by someone who seemed almost afraid of her own shadow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Linda had tried countless times to encourage Sarah to at least visit her old training center, to reconnect with the passion that had once burned so brightly in her eyes. But Sarah always changed the subject with a gentle firmness that brooked no argument. She had made her choice, she would say, and she was happy with her new life. The truth was more complicated than that. Sarah wasn't unhappy exactly, but she often felt like she was living in a costume that didn't quite fit, playing a role that required her to constantly monitor and suppress parts of herself that had once been as natural as breathing. When she watched action movies, her hands would unconsciously move through the motions of blocks and strikes. When she heard about violence in the news, her mind would automatically calculate response strategies and defensive positions. The warrior was still there, buried beneath layers of cardigans and good intentions. But Sarah had become so skilled at ignoring that part of herself that she genuinely believed it was gone forever. Her students at Riverside saw only the gentle, soft-spoken woman who encouraged their writing and listened patiently to their problems. Sarah had a particular gift for reaching the kids who struggled academically or socially, perhaps because she understood what it felt like to hide your true self from the world. She stayed after school to help with homework, wrote detailed comments on essays that other teachers might have skimmed through, and created creative assignments that allowed students to express themselves in ways that traditional academic work sometimes failed to accommodate. This dedication to her students' well-being made what was about to happen all the more shocking, both to Sarah and to the few people who thought they knew her. Because while Sarah had successfully hidden her past from her colleagues and students, she had not succeeded in making herself invisible to the sort of people who enjoyed causing pain to those they perceived as weak. She was about to discover that some situations cannot be resolved with kindness and understanding, and that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to remember who you used to be. The trouble had been brewing for weeks, though Sarah had tried to handle it through the proper channels, with her characteristic faith in the power of communication and institutional support. It had started small, as these things often do, with a group of senior boys who seemed to take particular pleasure in testing the boundaries of what they could get away with in her classroom. Brandon Mitchell was the ringleader, a 17-year-old, with the kind of natural charisma that could be used for great good or great harm, and he had unfortunately chosen the latter path. Tall and athletic with dark hair that he kept styled in the latest fashion, Brandon came from one of Millbrook's more prominent families, his father being a successful businessman who sat on the school board and made generous donations to the athletic program. This family connection had given Brandon a sense of untouchability that had only grown stronger as he progressed through high school without facing any real consequences for his increasingly aggressive behavior. He had gathered around him a group of like-minded followers: Tyler Johnson, whose quick temper and willingness to escalate any situation made him Brandon's perfect enforcer; Casey Thompson, who documented their exploits on his phone with the detached enthusiasm of a nature photographer; and Derek Walsh, whose specialty was psychological intimidation and who seemed to take genuine pleasure in making others uncomfortable. Together, they had turned disrupting Sarah's English class into a form of entertainment, starting with small infractions like talking during lessons and gradually escalating to more blatant disrespect. They would make inappropriate comments during discussions of literature, challenge her authority in front of other students, and create an atmosphere of tension that made it difficult for anyone else to learn. Sarah had tried everything she could think of to address the situation, speaking with them individually after class, calling their parents, and documenting every incident in detailed reports that she submitted to the administration. Principal Janet Williams, a harried woman in her 50s who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by the demands of managing 800 teenagers, had listened to Sarah's concerns with the sort of polite attention that suggested she had more pressing matters on her mind. The boys were just being boys, she had explained, and perhaps Sarah needed to establish better classroom management techniques. After all, Brandon Mitchell was a star on the football team and came from a good family, while Tyler Johnson was dealing with his parents' recent divorce, and perhaps a little understanding and patience would resolve the situation more effectively than disciplinary action. This response had left Sarah feeling frustrated and unsupported, but she had accepted it with the same quiet resignation that had characterized so much of her life since leaving karate. She would find a way to reach these students, she told herself, because that was what good teachers did. She would show them that literature could be engaging and relevant to their lives, and eventually their behavior would improve. She refused to acknowledge the small voice in the back of her mind that whispered about other, more direct ways to handle bullies, ways that her former self would have employed without hesitation. Mike Rodriguez had been less diplomatic in his assessment of the situation when Sarah had finally confided in him during lunch one particularly difficult day. Sitting in the teacher's lounge with its mismatched furniture and perpetually broken coffee machine, Mike had listened to Sarah's careful description of the boys' behavior with growing anger. He knew Brandon and his friends from the gym, where they displayed the same arrogant entitlement that apparently carried over into the classroom, and he had seen firsthand how their behavior affected other students who were afraid to speak up against them. Mike had offered to speak with the boys himself, using the sort of direct language that sometimes got through to teenage boys better than administrative memos, but Sarah had declined with typical politeness. She appreciated his concern, she had said, but she needed to handle this situation herself through proper channels and professional methods. She was a teacher, not a disciplinarian, and she believed that education and understanding could solve most problems if given enough time and patience. What Sarah didn't realize was that time was running out, and that Brandon Mitchell had interpreted her gentle responses to his behavior as weakness rather than professionalism. In his mind, he had found the perfect target, someone who would absorb his cruelty without fighting back. Someone whose obvious discomfort fed his need to feel powerful and in control. He had begun planning something that would humiliate Sarah so thoroughly that the story would spread throughout the school, cementing his reputation as someone who could get away with anything while simultaneously destroying her authority in the classroom. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal truths about both the gentle English teacher and the cocky teenager who thought he had her completely figured out. Neither of them knew that they were about to become part of a story that would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come, though for very different reasons than either of them expected. Sarah was about to learn that some parts of yourself can be buried but never truly destroyed. And Brandon was about to discover that the quiet strength he had mistaken for weakness was actually something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Sarah's apartment on Maple Street reflected the same careful neutrality that characterized her professional life. The small two-bedroom space was decorated in soft pastels and comfortable furniture from various discount stores, creating an environment that felt safe and unremarkable. Books lined every available wall space, creating a literary fortress that insulated her from the outside world. Her neighbors knew her as the quiet teacher who always said hello but never lingered for conversation, who received packages from online bookstores with religious regularity, and whose apartment was dark by 9 o'clock every night. The second bedroom served as her home office, where she graded papers at a small desk positioned near the window that overlooked the parking lot. It was here that she had spent countless hours crafting lesson plans designed to engage even the most reluctant students, drawing on her own experience of feeling like an outsider to create assignments that spoke to different learning styles and interests. The walls were covered with student work from her 3 years of teaching, essays and creative writing pieces that showed the impact she had made on young minds, though she rarely took time to acknowledge her own success. Hidden behind a false wall that she had installed herself during her first week in the apartment was the shrine to her former life that she could never quite bring herself to destroy. The space was small, barely large enough to stand in, but it contained the physical evidence of a decade of dedication to martial arts excellence. Trophies ranging from small local competitions to massive state championship awards lined makeshift shelves, their golden figures frozen in fighting stances that Sarah's body still remembered with muscle memory precision. Photographs showed a different version of herself, confident and fierce, her hair pulled back severely as she posed with medals and certificates that documented her rise through the ranks of competitive karate. The transformation from that confident warrior to the woman who now spent her evenings alone with books and tea had been gradual but deliberate. After leaving competition, Sarah had thrown herself into her education with the same intensity she had once applied to training, earning her teaching degree and credentials while carefully avoiding any situation that might require her to reveal her physical capabilities. She had chosen Millbrook specifically because it was far enough from her old life that no one would recognize her or know about her past achievements, allowing her to start fresh as simply Sarah, the teacher, rather than Sarah, the former champion. This carefully constructed new identity had served her well for the most part, giving her the anonymity she craved and the peaceful existence she thought she wanted. But it had also isolated her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had no close friends outside of her superficial friendship with Mike Rodriguez, no romantic relationship since college, and no hobbies or interests that brought her into contact with people who might see past her professional facade. She had created a life that was safe and predictable, but it was also increasingly lonely and emotionally sterile. The irony was not lost on her that she spent her days encouraging students to find their authentic voices and express their true selves through writing, while she herself was living a life built on concealment and self-denial. Her students' essays often moved her to tears with their honesty and vulnerability, their willingness to share their fears and dreams and struggles with someone who seemed to understand their pain. She gave them permission to be real in ways that she no longer allowed herself to be, creating a classroom environment where authenticity was valued and celebrated while her own authentic self remained locked away in a hidden room. The beginning of October brought the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Millbrook particularly beautiful. with maple trees turning brilliant shades of red and gold that framed the school in a picture postcard perfection. The students were settling into their routines after the chaos of the new school year, and Sarah had begun to hope that her problems with Brandon Mitchell and his friends might be resolving themselves. The boys had been somewhat better behaved in recent weeks, limiting their disruptions to eye rolls and whispered comments that she could choose to ignore rather than the open defiance that had characterized their earlier behavior. This temporary peace had allowed Sarah to focus on what she loved most about teaching. The moment when a struggling student suddenly understood a concept, or when a class discussion sparked genuine intellectual curiosity. Her advanced placement English class had been working through Shakespeare's Hamlet, and she had been thrilled to see even some of her more reluctant students engaging with the complex themes of revenge, justice, and moral ambiguity that made the play eternally relevant. She had designed a series of creative assignments that allowed students to explore these themes through modern parallels, encouraging them to see how the challenges faced by Shakespeare's characters reflected struggles they might encounter in their own lives. One of her favorite students, Emma Chun, had written a particularly insightful essay about Hamlet's delay in seeking revenge, drawing parallels to her own struggle with whether to report bullying she had witnessed in the hallways. Emma was a quiet girl who reminded Sarah of herself at that age, intelligent and observant, but lacking the confidence to speak up when she saw injustice occurring around her. Sarah had been careful to encourage Emma's analytical thinking while also gently suggesting that sometimes taking action, even when it felt scary, was the right thing to do. She had no idea that Emma was about to become an eyewitness to events that would test both of their understandings of courage and justice. The false sense of security that had settled over Sarah's classroom was shattered on a Tuesday morning in mid-October when Brandon Mitchell walked into her third period class with the swagger of someone who had just made a decision that would change everything. He had spent the weekend with his friends planning what they considered the ultimate prank, something that would humiliate their uptight English teacher so thoroughly that she would either quit or become so demoralized that she would never dare challenge their authority again. In their adolescent minds, they had convinced themselves that Sarah deserved whatever they were planning because she had failed to appreciate their natural superiority and had actually expected them to complete assignments and follow classroom rules like common students. Tyler Johnson entered the room behind Brandon with barely contained excitement, his usual aggressive energy amplified by anticipation of what was to come. Casey Thompson had his phone ready to record whatever happened, knowing that documentation would be crucial for sharing their triumph with the broader school community and ensuring that their victims' humiliation would be preserved for posterity. Derek Walsh brought up the rear with his characteristic cold smile, already planning the psychological follow-up attacks that would ensure Sarah never recovered from whatever was about to happen to her. Sarah noticed the change in their demeanor immediately, her teacher instincts alerting her to the fact that something was different about the boys' behavior, though she couldn't identify exactly what had shifted. They were more focused than usual, more purposeful in their movements, and there was an energy between them that suggested they were operating according to some predetermined plan. She felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach but pushed it aside, reminding herself that these were just teenage boys who were probably planning some minor disruption that she could handle with her usual combination of patience and redirection. The class began normally enough, with Sarah reviewing the previous day's discussion of Hamlet's famous soliloquy and introducing the day's focus on the theme of appearance versus reality throughout the play. She had prepared what she thought was an engaging lesson that would connect the deception and hidden motivations in Shakespeare's work to modern examples that her students could relate to, unaware of the cruel irony that she was about to become a living example of how thoroughly someone's true nature could be concealed beneath a carefully constructed exterior. Emma Chun sat in her usual seat in the front row, her notebook open and pen ready as she waited for the discussion to begin. She had noticed the strange behavior of Brandon's group as well, and something about their coordinated entrance had triggered the same instincts that had kept her safe during years of navigating the social minefield of high school as a quiet, academically focused student. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen, though like Sarah, she had no idea how bad things were about to become. As Sarah moved around the classroom, distributing handouts and engaging individual students in brief conversations about their understanding of the reading assignment, Brandon and his friends exchanged meaningful glances and subtle signals that coordinated their positioning. They had rehearsed their plan multiple times, working out the timing and logistics with the same attention to detail that they might have applied to a football play, though their goal was destruction rather than victory in any meaningful sense. The moment came when Sarah turned her back to write on the whiteboard, illustrating a point about dramatic irony that she thought would help her students understand Shakespeare's technique. She was completely absorbed in her explanation, her voice taking on the enthusiasm that always emerged when she was discussing literature she loved, when she felt hands grabbing at her skirt from behind. The shock of the physical contact froze her for a crucial second, long enough for Brandon and Tyler to accomplish their goal of lifting her modest knee-length skirt above her waist, exposing her to the entire class in a moment of violation that went far beyond typical teenage mischief. The classroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, nervous laughter, and uncomfortable silence as students processed what they were witnessing. Some laughed because they didn't know how else to react to such an unprecedented breach of normal behavior, while others sat in stunned silence, recognizing that they were witnessing something cruel and wrong, but uncertain how to respond. Emma Chun felt sick to her stomach as she watched her favorite teacher stand frozen in humiliation, her face burning with shame as she struggled to process what had just happened to her. Sarah's first instinct was to pull her skirt down and retreat, to minimize the exposure and try to regain some semblance of dignity and control over the situation. Her hands shook as she adjusted her clothing, her mind racing through potential responses while her body trembled with a combination of shock, embarrassment, and something else, something deeper and more dangerous that she had spent years suppressing. The laughter of Brandon and his friends echoed in her ears like the sound of her opponent's ribs breaking all those years ago, a sound that had haunted her dreams and shaped her determination to never again be the cause of someone else's pain. But as she stood there, facing the class with her professional authority shattered and her personal dignity violated, Sarah felt something shifting inside her that she had not experienced since that night she walked away from competition. The warrior that she had buried beneath layers of cardigans and good intentions was stirring, responding to a threat in the way that 10 years of intensive training had programmed her to respond. Her breathing began to change, becoming deeper and more controlled as her body automatically assumed a more balanced stance, though she was not yet consciously aware of the transformation that was beginning to occur. The boys were still laughing, still high on their perceived victory, when Sarah turned around to face them with an expression that should have warned them that they had made a terrible miscalculation. Her green eyes, usually soft and encouraging, had taken on a hardness that spoke of capabilities they could not have imagined, and her posture had shifted in ways so subtle that only someone trained in reading body language for tactical purposes would have recognized the signs. She was no longer simply Sarah, the gentle English teacher who could be victimized with impunity. She was becoming something else, something that had been sleeping but was now very much awake. Emma Chun noticed the change immediately, her own survival instincts recognizing that the dynamic in the room had shifted in ways that the laughing boys had not yet perceived. She had seen her teacher angry before, had witnessed the quiet disappointment that Sarah expressed when students failed to meet expectations or behave disrespectfully, but this was something entirely different. This was the look of someone who had been pushed past a boundary that should never have been crossed, Someone who was calculating responses and consequences with a precision that suggested capabilities far beyond those of a typical high school English teacher. The transformation was not yet complete, and Sarah was still fighting against instincts that urged her toward responses that her rational mind insisted were inappropriate for a classroom setting. She stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, her body and mind at war with each other as years of careful self-control battled against reflexes that had been honed through thousands of hours of training. She could feel her muscles coiling with potential energy, her mind automatically assessing angles and distances and vulnerabilities, her breathing settling into the rhythm that had once preceded every competition. Brandon Mitchell was still laughing when he noticed that Sarah had not responded in the way he had expected. He had anticipated tears, perhaps, or angry words that would give him an excuse to escalate the confrontation further. Instead, she was looking at him with an intensity that made him suddenly uncomfortable, though his adolescent pride prevented him from acknowledging that he might have misjudged the situation. Tyler Johnson was beginning to sense that something was wrong, his aggression giving way to uncertainty as he noticed the change in their target's demeanor. But he was committed to following Brandon's lead, regardless of his own growing discomfort. Casey Thompson continued recording on his phone, though he was starting to realize that what he was capturing might not be the triumphant humiliation of a weak teacher that he had expected to document. There was something about Sarah's stillness that suggested power rather than defeat, something about her focused attention that felt more like a predator assessing prey than a victim cowering from attack. Derek Walsh had stopped smiling entirely, his instincts for psychological manipulation recognizing that he was now dealing with someone who was not responding according to the script they had written for this encounter. The other students in the classroom were beginning to recognize that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that went beyond typical teenage rebellion or even serious disciplinary problems. Emma Chun found herself leaning forward in her seat, her academic mind cataloging details that she would later struggle to process and understand. There was something about the way Sarah was standing, the way she was breathing, the way her attention was focused on the boys who had attacked her, that suggested training and experience that had nothing to do with lesson plans and literature. Discussions. Sarah's internal struggle was reaching a crisis point as she fought to maintain the identity she had carefully constructed while dealing with a situation that her training told her required a very different kind of response. She could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once preceded every match, the sharpening of focus that eliminated everything except the immediate tactical situation, the automatic assessment of threats and available responses that had made her such a formidable competitor. But she was also acutely aware that she was in a classroom full of teenagers, that she was a professional educator with responsibilities that extended far beyond her own desire for justice or revenge. The moment stretched on as Sarah wrestled with decisions that would determine not only her own future, but the futures of everyone in that classroom. She could feel the eyes of her students on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this unprecedented violation of normal boundaries. And she knew that whatever she did next would be talked about and remembered for years to come. The question was whether she would continue to be Sarah the victim, accepting this humiliation as the price of maintaining her carefully constructed peaceful existence, or whether she would finally acknowledge the warrior who had never really gone away, who had been waiting patiently for a situation that required her particular skills and experience. The decision was made not by her rational mind but by her body, which had been trained for too many years to submit to attack without response. As Brandon Mitchell reached toward her again, apparently intending to repeat his assault now that he had tasted the intoxicating power of successful humiliation, Sarah's reflexes took over in ways that bypassed her conscious control entirely. Her hand moved with the speed and precision that had once earned her the nickname Lightning Sarah. intercepting his reaching arm with a grip that stopped his movement instantly and caused him to gasp in surprise at the sudden, unexpected pain. The transformation was no longer internal and invisible. Sarah Collins, mild-mannered English teacher, was becoming someone else entirely. Someone who had been hidden but never truly gone. Someone who was about to remind everyone in that classroom that appearances could be very deceiving indeed. The warrior was awakening, and the consequences would change everything for everyone involved in ways that none of them could have anticipated when they walked into room 204 that Tuesday morning. Brandon's gasp of pain cut through the laughter and murmurs of the other students like a knife, creating a sudden silence that felt heavy with potential energy. His cocky expression transformed into one of shock and confusion as he tried unsuccessfully to pull his arm free from Sarah's grip, discovering that what appeared to be a gentle teacher's hand was actually something far more formidable. The pressure she was applying to his wrist was precise and scientifically calculated, targeting nerve points that sent shooting pains up his arm while simultaneously preventing him from using his superior size and strength to break free. Tyler Johnson's aggressive posture faltered as he witnessed his leader's sudden vulnerability, his teenage brain struggling to process the fact that their soft target had somehow turned the tables in a way that defied everything they thought they knew about power dynamics and social hierarchies. He had expected Sarah to cower or cry or run to the administration for help, responses that would have confirmed their assessment of her as weak and deserving of their contempt. Instead, she was demonstrating a kind of physical competence that belonged in an entirely different category of human being. Someone who had clearly been trained in ways that had nothing to do with education or literature. The other students in the classroom were witnessing something that would become a defining memory of their high school experience, though they would struggle for years to articulate exactly what they had seen. Emma Chun later described it as watching a butterfly transform back into the caterpillar, except that the caterpillar turned out to be something far more dangerous and beautiful than anyone had realized. Other students would talk about the way Sarah's entire bearing had changed, how she had seemed to grow taller and more substantial even though her physical dimensions remained the same, how her voice had taken on a quality of authority that made everyone in the room sit up straighter and pay attention in ways that went far beyond typical classroom management. Sarah herself was experiencing the disorienting sensation of muscle memory overriding years of careful conditioning, her body remembering skills and capabilities that her conscious mind had tried to forget. The grip she had on Brandon's wrist was textbook perfect, applied with just enough pressure to control his movement without causing permanent damage, though she could have easily escalated to techniques that would have put him on the ground in considerable pain. Her breathing had settled into the controlled rhythm that had once preceded every competition. Her center of gravity had shifted to a more stable and responsive position, and her awareness had expanded to encompass every person and potential threat in the room with the kind of tactical assessment that became second nature after years of serious martial arts training. The silence in the classroom was broken by Brandon's attempt to assert his dominance through verbal intimidation, though his voice cracked slightly as he demanded that Sarah release him immediately. His words carried less authority than usual, undermined by the obvious fact that he was the one being controlled rather than the one in control. And his friends recognized that their carefully planned humiliation had somehow backfired in ways they had not anticipated. Casey Thompson continued recording on his phone, though he was beginning to realize that what he was capturing might not be the evidence of victimization that they had intended to create and share. Sarah's response came in a voice that her students had never heard before, low and controlled and carrying the kind of quiet authority that commanded immediate attention and respect. She explained to Brandon that he had made a serious error in judgment, that he had crossed a line that should never be crossed, and that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond whatever temporary satisfaction he might have gained from humiliating someone he perceived as weak. Her words were measured and precise, delivered with the kind of calm intensity that made it clear she was completely in control of both herself and the situation, though she was still fighting against instincts that urged her toward more direct and physical responses. The transformation in Sarah's demeanor was so complete and so unexpected that several of her students would later describe feeling like they were meeting their teacher for the first time, as if the person they had known for months or years had been replaced by someone who shared the same appearance, but possessed entirely different capabilities and presence. Emma Chun found herself thinking about the discussions they had been having about appearance versus reality in Hamlet, recognizing that she was witnessing a real-life demonstration of how thoroughly someone's true nature could be concealed beneath a carefully constructed exterior. As Sarah continued to hold Brandon's wrist in her precisely calibrated grip, she became aware that she was at a crossroads that would determine not only the immediate outcome of this confrontation, but the entire trajectory of her carefully constructed new life. She could feel the attention of every person in the room focused on her with an intensity that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Recognition that she was no longer invisible or ignorable, but was instead commanding the kind of respect and attention that she had not experienced since her competition days. The question was whether she would retreat back into her shell of professional propriety or acknowledge the warrior who had never really gone away, who was even now assessing the situation with the cold calculation of someone trained to neutralize threats efficiently and decisively. The moment stretched on as Sarah wrestled with decisions that would have consequences extending far beyond this single classroom confrontation, though she was beginning to realize that some choices had already been made for her by reflexes and instincts that had been dormant, but never truly suppressed. The careful balance she had maintained between her former self and her current identity was collapsing, and she was going to have to decide who she really was and who she wanted to be going forward. The shy English teacher was becoming someone else entirely, someone who had been hidden but never truly gone, someone who was about to change everything for everyone involved in ways that none of them could have predicted when they walked into room 204 that Tuesday morning. The grip Sarah maintained on Brandon's wrist had achieved something she hadn't experienced in 6 years: complete silence and undivided attention from every person in the room. For a brief, intoxicating moment, she felt the rush of absolute control that had once defined her existence in competition rings across the Midwest. Brandon's attempts to pull free only tightened her hold, his face reddening as he realized that his physical superiority meant nothing against technique he couldn't understand or counter. The other students watched with a mixture of fascination and fear as their quiet English teacher demonstrated capabilities that belonged in an entirely different world from lesson plans and literary analysis. Sarah could feel the familiar surge of confidence that had once made her unstoppable in tournament brackets, the sense of physical and mental harmony that came from operating at the peak of her abilities. Her breathing had settled into the controlled rhythm that maximized oxygen flow while maintaining the relaxed alertness that made lightning-fast responses possible. Her feet had automatically shifted to a more balanced stance, her weight distributed in ways that would allow for instant movement in any direction, her free hand positioned to block or strike with the efficiency that had earned her countless victories against opponents who underestimated her speed and precision. Tyler Johnson made the mistake of stepping forward to help his friend, his aggressive nature overriding his growing recognition that the situation had shifted beyond their understanding or control. Sarah's peripheral vision tracked his movement with the kind of tactical awareness that becomes instinctive after years of facing multiple opponents in training scenarios, and her body responded before her conscious mind had fully processed the new threat. Her free hand moved in a simple blocking motion that intercepted Tyler's reaching arm, redirecting his forward momentum in a way that sent him stumbling backward into a desk with a crash that echoed through the suddenly tense classroom. The demonstration of her ability to control 2 opponents simultaneously while maintaining perfect composure, sent a ripple of shock through the watching students, many of whom were beginning to realize that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their educational experience. Emma Chun found herself leaning forward in her seat, her analytical mind racing to process the implications of what she was seeing, while her emotional response swung between admiration for her teacher's unexpected capabilities and concern about how this confrontation might end. She had read enough about martial arts to recognize that Sarah's movements displayed the kind of precision and efficiency that came only from extensive training and real experience, though she couldn't imagine how or when their mild-mannered English teacher had acquired such skills. Casey Thompson's phone continued recording, though he was beginning to understand that he might be documenting something that could have serious legal and disciplinary consequences for everyone involved. The casual prank that was supposed to humiliate a weak teacher had transformed into something far more complex and potentially dangerous, with their intended victim demonstrating physical capabilities that suggested a background none of them had suspected. His finger hovered over the stop button as he wrestled with the recognition that continuing to record might preserve evidence of their own criminal behavior rather than their expected triumph over someone they had perceived as helpless. Derek Walsh had retreated to the back of the classroom, his instincts for psychological manipulation recognizing that he was now dealing with someone who possessed resources and capabilities that rendered his usual tactics not only ineffective but potentially dangerous to employ. His cruel smile had been replaced by a careful neutrality as he calculated potential escape routes and responses, his survival instincts overriding his commitment to the group dynamic that had brought them to this point. He was beginning to understand that they had seriously misjudged their target and that the consequences of that miscalculation might extend far beyond anything they had considered when planning their attack. Sarah maintained her grip on Brandon while simultaneously monitoring Tyler's position and the reactions of every other person in the room. Her awareness expanded to encompass threats and variables with the kind of comprehensive tactical assessment that had once made her nearly unbeatable in competition. She could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline that sharpened her focus while maintaining the emotional control that prevented her from escalating beyond what the situation required, though she was acutely aware that her body was prepared for responses that would be entirely inappropriate in a classroom setting. The warrior consciousness that she had spent years suppressing was fully awakened now, evaluating options and calculating consequences with the cold precision that had once terrified opponents who expected to face a gentle young woman, but instead encountered something far more formidable. The moment of triumph was intoxicating, a reminder of who she had once been and what she was capable of when she allowed her true nature to emerge from behind the careful facade of professional propriety. For the first time in 6 years, Sarah felt completely authentic, completely herself, operating from a place of genuine strength rather than the defensive vulnerability that had characterized her teaching career. She could see the respect and fear in the eyes of students who had previously dismissed her as just another adult authority figure to be manipulated or ignored. Recognition that she was someone worth taking seriously in ways that went far beyond academic requirements. But even as she savored the moment of vindication, Sarah was becoming aware of the broader implications of what was happening in room 204. She was a professional educator who had just demonstrated the ability to physically control and potentially harm students, regardless of the provocation they had provided or the justice of her response. The careful life she had constructed was crumbling around her as the hidden aspects of her identity emerged in ways that would be impossible to explain or rationalize to administrators, parents, or colleagues who knew her only as the quiet English teacher who had never caused problems or raised concerns. Principal Janet Williams would need to be notified of the incident, though Sarah couldn't imagine how she would explain what had transpired without revealing the extensive martial arts background that she had kept hidden for her entire teaching career. The school board would demand answers about how and why a high school English teacher possessed the kind of physical capabilities that she had just demonstrated, and her carefully constructed professional reputation would be destroyed by questions about her past and speculation about her true qualifications for working with vulnerable teenagers. The peaceful anonymity that had defined her life in Millbrook was ending in the most dramatic and public way possible. The other students in the classroom were processing what they had witnessed with the kind of shocked fascination that would fuel rumors and speculation for months to come. Sarah knew that by the end of the day, distorted versions of the story would be spreading throughout the school and into the broader community, transforming her from the invisible teacher who minded her own business into the subject of gossip and controversy that would follow her wherever she went. The secret she had guarded so carefully was now exposed in the most public and dramatic way possible, and there would be no returning to the safe obscurity she had worked so hard to maintain. Brandon's continued struggles to free himself from her grip were becoming weaker and more desperate, his teenage arrogance giving way to genuine fear as he began to understand that he was dealing with someone who possessed capabilities he couldn't comprehend or counter. The casual cruelty that had motivated his attack on what he perceived as a helpless victim was being replaced by the recognition that he might have made a serious error in judgment, one that could have consequences extending far beyond the temporary embarrassment he had intended to inflict. His friend's failure to intervene effectively was forcing him to confront the possibility that he was not as powerful or untouchable as he had believed. Sarah could feel the precise amount of pressure required to maintain control without causing permanent damage, her training allowing her to calibrate her grip with the kind of scientific precision that left no room for accidental injury, while ensuring that her opponent remained completely unable to escape or retaliate. It was a skill that had taken years to develop and had been honed through countless hours of practice against opponents who were specifically trying to break free from various holds and restraints, experience that had prepared her for exactly this type of situation, even though she had never imagined using it in a classroom setting. The silence in room 204 was broken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside, a reminder that they were in a public building where their confrontation would inevitably attract attention from other teachers, administrators, or students who might intervene or witness what was happening. Sarah realized that she needed to make a decision about how to conclude this situation before external factors forced resolutions that might be even more problematic than the current standoff, though she was struggling to find a path that would allow her to maintain her professional standing while acknowledging the realities of what had already transpired. The approaching footsteps belonged to Mike Rodriguez, who had been walking past Sarah's classroom when he heard the unusual sounds that suggested something was wrong. His friendship with Sarah had given him insights into her character that made him more attuned to changes in her normal patterns, and the quality of silence from a room that usually buzzed with discussion and activity had triggered his protective instincts. He paused outside the door, listening carefully to assess whether intervention was needed or welcome, unaware that he was about to witness a side of his colleague that would challenge everything he thought he knew about her. Sarah heard Mike's distinctive footsteps and recognized that her window for controlling the narrative about what had happened was rapidly closing. Once other adults became involved, the incident would move beyond her ability to manage privately, and she would be forced to explain her actions and capabilities to people who had no context for understanding either her response or the provocation that had triggered it. The careful balance she had maintained between her former identity and her current life was collapsing, and she was going to have to make decisions about which version of herself she wanted to acknowledge going forward. Emma Chun was watching the unfolding drama with the intensity of someone who recognized that she was witnessing a defining moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Her academic mind was cataloging details that would allow her to provide accurate testimony about what she had observed, while her emotional response alternated between admiration for her teacher's unexpected strength and concern about the potential consequences for everyone involved. She had developed genuine affection and respect for Sarah over their months of interaction, and she was beginning to understand the gentle woman who had encouraged her academic growth possessed depths and capabilities that extended far beyond anything she had imagined. The sound of Mike's hand on the door handle galvanized Sarah into action, forcing her to make decisions about how to conclude the confrontation before external intervention complicated an already complex situation. She could maintain her grip on Brandon indefinitely, demonstrating her complete control over someone who had attempted to victimize her. But such a display would only create more questions and problems when other adults arrived to assess what was happening. Alternatively, she could release him and attempt to return to some semblance of normal classroom management, though the fundamental power dynamic had shifted in ways that would make such a return impossible. The choice was made for her by Brandon himself, who finally managed to gasp out an apology that acknowledged both the inappropriateness of his actions and his recognition that he was dealing with someone far more formidable than he had realized. His words were grudging and incomplete, motivated more by fear than genuine remorse, but they provided Sarah with an opportunity to demonstrate mercy and restraint while maintaining the authority she had established through her display of superior capability. She released his wrist with a final pressure that reminded him of her continuing ability to inflict pain if he chose to escalate further, then stepped back to a position that allowed her to monitor all potential threats while appearing to resume her normal teaching posture. Brandon stumbled backward, rubbing his wrist and staring at Sarah with a mixture of shock, fear, and grudging respect that represented a complete transformation from the arrogant contempt he had displayed just minutes earlier. Tyler Johnson remained where he had fallen, his aggressive posture replaced by wary uncertainty as he processed the fact that their intended victim had effortlessly controlled both of them while maintaining perfect composure throughout the encounter. Casey Thompson had stopped recording, his phone lowered as he grappled with the recognition that he had captured evidence of their own humiliation, rather than their expected triumph over someone they had perceived as weak. The door opened to admit Mike Rodriguez, whose cheerful expression quickly transformed into concern as he took in the tense atmosphere and unusual positioning of students and teacher throughout the classroom. His experienced eye immediately recognized that some kind of confrontation had occurred, though the specific details were unclear from the evidence available to him. Sarah met his questioning gaze with a calm professionalism that gave no indication of the internal transformation she had just experienced, though Mike's familiarity with her usual demeanor allowed him to detect subtle changes that suggested something significant had transpired. Sarah's response to Mike's unspoken questions was carefully crafted to acknowledge the incident, without revealing the full extent of what had occurred or the capability she had demonstrated. She explained that there had been a disciplinary issue that she had resolved through direct intervention, language that was technically accurate while avoiding details that would raise questions about her methods or background. Her voice carried the same quiet authority that had commanded the classroom's attention during the confrontation, though she was careful to modulate it to levels appropriate for normal professional interaction. Mike's assessment of the situation was complicated by his recognition that the classroom's atmosphere felt different in ways he couldn't fully articulate, as if the fundamental power dynamics had shifted in directions that weren't immediately apparent from surface observations. Brandon and his friends appeared subdued in ways that went beyond typical responses to administrative intervention, while the other students seemed to be processing something significant that had occurred before his arrival. Sarah herself was exhibiting a confidence and presence that he had never observed in their previous interactions, suggesting that whatever had happened had affected her as much as her students. The remainder of the class period passed in unusual quiet, with students completing assigned work with a focus and attention that was remarkable for its intensity and consistency. Brandon and his friends made no further attempts at disruption, their previous arrogance replaced by a careful neutrality that suggested they had learned important lessons about the consequences of underestimating their targets. Emma Chun continued to steal glances at her teacher, her admiration growing as she reflected on the strength and composure that Sarah had demonstrated under circumstances that would have left most people devastated and helpless. Sarah conducted the rest of her lesson with the same professionalism she had always maintained, though she was acutely aware that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with her students and her understanding of herself, the warrior. Consciousness that had emerged during the confrontation remained active beneath her composed exterior, monitoring the room for potential threats while simultaneously processing the implications of what she had revealed about her true capabilities. She knew that there would be consequences for her actions and questions about her background that she would eventually need to address. But for the moment, she was simply savoring the feeling of operating from a place of authentic strength rather than defensive vulnerability. The bell-ending third period created a release of tension that was almost audible as students gathered their belongings and filed out of room 204 with unusual orderliness, many of them stealing final glances at their teacher as they processed what they had witnessed. Brandon and his friends were among the first to leave, their hasty exit suggesting that they had no desire to risk further confrontation with someone they now recognized as far more formidable than they had imagined. Emma Chun lingered briefly, her expression conveying respect and curiosity that she didn't yet have words to articulate, before following her classmates into the hallway, buzzing with whispered conversations about what might have happened in the English classroom. Mike remained behind as the last student departed, his concern for Sarah's well-being overriding his usual respect for her privacy and independence. His questions were gentle but persistent, reflecting his recognition that something significant had occurred and his desire to provide whatever support might be needed to help her process the experience. Sarah's responses were carefully measured, acknowledging his concern while maintaining the boundaries around information that could complicate her professional standing or personal safety if it became widely known. The conversation between Sarah and Mike was interrupted by the arrival of Principal Williams, whose appearance suggested that word of the incident had already begun spreading through the school's informal communication networks. Her expression combined administrative concern with the kind of wariness that suggested she was prepared to deal with a complex disciplinary situation that might have legal or public relations implications. Sarah recognized that her carefully controlled narrative about what had occurred was about to be tested by official scrutiny that could expose aspects of her background and capabilities that she had hoped to keep private. The questioning that followed was professional but thorough, with Principal Williams seeking to understand exactly what had transpired in room 204 and whether additional intervention or investigation would be required. Sarah's responses continued to focus on the inappropriate behavior of the students involved while minimizing details about her own physical response, though she was aware that other witnesses might provide information that would contradict or complicate her carefully edited version of events. The hidden aspects of her identity that had emerged during the confrontation were creating ripple effects that would be increasingly difficult to control or contain. As the immediate crisis management concluded and normal school operations resumed around them, Sarah found herself contemplating a future that would inevitably be different from the carefully anonymous existence she had constructed in Millbrook. The warrior who had been awakened during the confrontation with Brandon and his friends was not someone who could be easily returned to hiding, and the questions raised by her demonstration of unexpected capabilities would require answers that might expose everything she had worked to keep secret. The peaceful life she had built was ending, but something new and potentially more authentic was beginning to emerge from its ruins. The weeks following the incident in room 204 unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of revelation and transformation that would reshape not only Sarah's life, but the entire culture of Riverside High School. What had begun as a moment of teenage cruelty had triggered a cascade of consequences that no one could have predicted when Brandon Mitchell first decided to humiliate his quiet English teacher. The investigation launched by Principal Williams had uncovered layers of systemic bullying that had been festering beneath the surface of the school's polished exterior, while Sarah's response had inadvertently become a catalyst for changes that extended far beyond a single classroom confrontation. The first domino to fall was Casey Thompson's phone recording, which he had initially planned to delete after witnessing how dramatically their prank had backfired. His parents discovered the video during a routine check of his device, and their horror at what they witnessed prompted them to contact the school administration immediately. The footage provided indisputable evidence of not only the sexual assault committed against Sarah, but also her remarkably controlled and professional response to an attack that could have justified far more severe retaliation. Within hours, the video had been turned over to law enforcement, and the Millbrook Police Department had opened a criminal investigation into the assault. Detective Maria Santos, a 15-year veteran of the force who specialized in cases involving violence against women, reviewed the footage with the kind of professional attention that came from years of investigating similar crimes. What she saw defied her expectations in ways that both impressed and concerned her professional judgment. The video clearly showed Sarah being sexually assaulted by multiple students, but her response demonstrated capabilities that suggested extensive training in combat techniques that went far beyond typical self-defense courses. Detective Santos recognized that she was dealing with someone who possessed skills that could have inflicted serious injury on the attackers, but had chosen restraint and precise control instead. The criminal charges filed against Brandon Mitchell, Tyler Johnson, and Derek Walsh sent shockwaves through Millbrook's tightly knit community, where such serious legal consequences for teenage behavior were virtually unprecedented. The charges included sexual assault, conspiracy, and harassment, with additional considerations for the fact that the attack had been planned and recorded for distribution. Brandon's father, whose position on the school board had previously insulated his son from meaningful consequences, found himself facing a legal and public relations nightmare that threatened both his business interests and his family's reputation in the community. Sarah's initial relief at seeing justice served was quickly complicated by the realization that her own background would inevitably become part of the investigation and public record. Detective Santos approached her with questions about her training and experience that Sarah could no longer deflect or minimize, forcing her to confront the reality that her carefully guarded secret was now exposed to official scrutiny. The conversation that followed in the police station's interview room marked the end of Sarah Collins, the anonymous English teacher, and the beginning of a more complex public identity that acknowledged both her professional dedication and her extraordinary personal capabilities. The revelation that Riverside High School's quiet English teacher was actually Sarah "Lightning" Collins, former state karate champion and nationally ranked competitor, transformed her overnight from a local footnote into a regional celebrity, whose story captured public imagination in ways she had never anticipated. Local news stations picked up the story first, followed by regional outlets and eventually national media organizations that were fascinated by the narrative of a warrior hiding in plain sight who had emerged to defend herself against attackers who had no idea what they were facing. The media attention was both validating and overwhelming for someone who had spent 6 years cultivating anonymity and avoiding any situation that might expose her past achievements or current capabilities. Reporters camped outside her apartment building in the school, seeking interviews and additional details about her competition career and the circumstances that had led her to abandon martial arts for education. Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, reminding her of the attention she had once received as a successful competitor while forcing her to navigate questions about personal choices and professional decisions that she had never expected to discuss publicly. Mike Rodriguez became an unexpected ally during this period of intense scrutiny, using his natural charisma and communication skills to help manage media requests while protecting Sarah's privacy and emotional well-being. His genuine friendship and professional respect for her teaching abilities provided a stable foundation as she navigated the complex process of integrating her hidden past with her public present. Their conversations during lunch breaks and after school became a crucial outlet for processing the dramatic changes in her life and planning for a future that would inevitably be different from anything she had previously imagined. The student body's reaction to the revelations about their English teacher ranged from shock and admiration to fear and resentment, depending on their previous relationships with Sarah and their attitudes toward authority figures in general. Emma Chun became something of a celebrity herself as one of the primary witnesses to the classroom confrontation, and her articulate descriptions of Sarah's composure and restraint under extreme provocation helped shape public perception of the incident in ways that emphasized Sarah's professionalism rather than her capacity for violence. The transformation in classroom dynamics was immediate and profound, with students who had previously viewed Sarah as a pushover suddenly recognizing that they were dealing with someone who commanded respect through genuine strength rather than institutional authority. Her lessons took on new energy as students who had been disengaged or disruptive found themselves genuinely curious about the person behind the carefully constructed professional facade. Discussions of literature became more dynamic and honest, as students felt safe to explore complex themes with someone they now recognized as possessing both intellectual depth and personal courage. The administrative response to the incident was complicated by the need to balance support for a teacher who had been victimized against concerns about liability and public perception regarding her undisclosed background. Principal Williams found herself defending Sarah's actions while simultaneously implementing new policies designed to prevent similar incidents and address the systemic bullying problems that the investigation had revealed. The school board meetings became contentious affairs as community members debated whether Sarah's hidden martial arts expertise represented a safety concern or a valuable asset for maintaining school security. The legal proceedings against Brandon and his accomplices unfolded over several months, during which Sarah was required to testify about both the assault itself and her response to it. Her testimony was measured and professional, acknowledging her training while emphasizing her commitment to using minimal force necessary to protect herself and maintain classroom order. The defense attorney's attempts to portray her as a dangerous individual who had overreacted to teenage pranks were undermined by the video evidence and witness testimony that clearly showed her restraint and proportional response to a serious criminal attack. The sentencing hearing provided Sarah with an opportunity to address her attackers directly, and her statement became a defining moment in the case that was widely reported and discussed in local media. She spoke about the impact of their actions, not only on her personally, but on the classroom environment and the other students who had been forced to witness their cruel behavior. Her words carried the weight of someone who understood both the capacity for violence and the importance of choosing restraint, offering a perspective on justice and consequence that impressed even those who had initially questioned her methods. Brandon Mitchell's conviction and sentencing to community service, counseling, and a permanent criminal record marked the end of his reign of terror at Riverside High School, while sending a clear message to other potential bullies about the serious consequences of their actions. His public apology, delivered as part of his sentencing requirements, acknowledged not only the criminal nature of his assault on Sarah, but the broader pattern of intimidation and harassment that had characterized his behavior throughout his high school career. The apology was grudging and incomplete, but it represented a recognition of responsibility that marked the beginning of a long process of accountability and potential rehabilitation. Tyler Johnson and Derek Walsh received similar sentences, though their responses to the legal consequences varied significantly based on their individual circumstances and family support systems. Tyler's anger management issues were addressed through mandatory counseling that helped him understand the connections between his aggressive behavior and his parents' divorce, while Derek's psychological evaluation revealed underlying issues that required more intensive therapeutic intervention. The legal system's response to their crimes became a model for addressing teenage violence that balanced accountability with opportunities for rehabilitation and growth. The broader impact of the incident extended far beyond the immediate participants to encompass changes in school policy, community attitudes, and regional discussions about bullying prevention and response. Riverside High School implemented comprehensive anti-bullying programs that emphasized both prevention and intervention, while the Millbrook community began conversations about the cultural factors that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked for so long. Sarah's story became a catalyst for examining assumptions about strength, vulnerability, and the ways that appearances could deceive even careful observers. The revelation of Sarah's background also prompted discussions about professional disclosure requirements and the extent to which employees should be required to reveal personal capabilities or training that might be relevant to their work environments. Educational policy experts debated whether Sarah's undisclosed martial arts expertise represented a breach of professional transparency or simply personal privacy that had no bearing on her teaching qualifications. The conversations highlighted broader questions about the balance between institutional security concerns and individual rights to privacy about past achievements or capabilities. As the immediate crisis subsided and normal routines resumed, Sarah found herself fundamentally changed by the experience of acknowledging and integrating the different aspects of her identity that she had kept carefully separated for so many years. The warrior consciousness that had emerged during the confrontation with Brandon and his friends could no longer be suppressed or ignored. But neither could the genuine passion for education and student development that had motivated her. Career transition. The challenge became finding ways to honor both aspects of herself while building a life that felt authentic and sustainable. The decision to embrace rather than hide her martial arts background opened opportunities that Sarah had never considered. During her years of self-imposed anonymity, local law enforcement agencies approached her about providing self-defense training for officers and community members, while regional schools sought her expertise in developing anti-bullying programs that combined educational approaches with practical security measures. The recognition that her unique combination of teaching skills and physical capabilities could serve broader community needs represented a potential career path that had never existed when she was forced to choose between martial arts and education. The relationship with her students evolved in ways that reflected their new understanding of her capabilities, while maintaining the academic focus and emotional support that had always characterized her teaching approach. Emma Chun emerged as a particularly insightful observer of the changes, noting in a reflective essay that their teacher had become more rather than less approachable as a result of revealing her hidden strength. The recognition that Sarah possessed extraordinary capabilities while choosing to use them responsibly and proportionally had enhanced rather than diminished their respect for her judgment and leadership. The integration of her martial arts background into her teaching practice took forms that surprised even Sarah herself, as she discovered connections between physical discipline and mental focus that enhanced her ability to help students develop confidence and self-control. Her approach to classroom management became more nuanced and effective as she drew on her understanding of dominance hierarchies and conflict resolution to create learning environments that felt both safe and challenging. The lessons she had learned about perseverance, respect, and personal responsibility through years of martial arts training found new expression in her efforts to guide teenagers through the complexities of academic and social development. The anniversary of the incident was marked by a special assembly at Riverside High School that celebrated not only Sarah's courage and professionalism, but the broader changes that had resulted from the confrontation and its aftermath. Student speakers included Emma Chun, who had become a powerful advocate for anti-bullying efforts, and several others who credited Sarah's example with inspiring them to find their own courage in difficult situations. The event highlighted the transformation of the school culture from one that tolerated and enabled bullying to one that actively promoted respect, accountability, and mutual support among students and staff. Sarah's speech at the anniversary assembly reflected on the lessons learned from an experience that had forced her to confront fundamental questions about identity, authenticity, and the courage required to live according to one's deepest values. She spoke about the importance of recognizing that strength could take many forms, that vulnerability was not weakness, and that the most powerful response to cruelty was often the choice to remain true to one's principles, even under extreme pressure. Her words resonated with students and community members who had followed her journey from anonymous teacher to local hero, offering insights that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of her confrontation with teenage bullies. The standing ovation that followed Sarah's remarks represented not only appreciation for her individual courage, but recognition of the broader transformation that had occurred throughout the school and community as a result of her example. Students, who had previously felt helpless in the face of bullying, had found their voices and their strength, while adults had been forced to confront their own failures to protect vulnerable young people from predatory behavior. The incident had become a catalyst for positive change that extended far beyond anything that could have been predicted when it began with a moment of teenage cruelty in room 204. As Sarah looked out at the assembled crowd of students, teachers, parents, and community members who had gathered to mark this milestone, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from hiding in plain sight to standing proudly in the spotlight as someone who embodied the integration of strength and compassion, power and restraint, warrior spirit and educational dedication. The shy teacher who had once been terrified of revealing her true capabilities had become a confident leader who understood that authentic strength came not from hiding who you are, but from having the courage to be fully yourself, regardless of how others might react or respond. The final chapter of Sarah's story was not an ending but a beginning, the start of a new phase of life that honored all aspects of her identity while serving purposes larger than her own comfort or security. She had learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in competition rings or tournament brackets, but in everyday moments when someone must choose between safety and authenticity, between hiding and standing up for what is right. Her journey from lightning Sarah to gentle teacher to integrated warrior educator had taught her that true strength lay not in the ability to defeat opponents, but in the wisdom to know when and how to use power in service of justice, protection, and growth. The transformation was complete, but the story continued, as Sarah embraced a future that promised new challenges and opportunities to make a difference in the lives of students and community members who needed examples of courage, integrity, and the kind of quiet strength that could emerge from the most unexpected places when circumstances demanded nothing less than heroism. The transformation of Sarah Collins from hidden warrior to celebrated educator-protector reached its culmination during the spring semester, 6 months after the incident that had shattered her carefully constructed anonymity and forced her to confront the deepest truths about her identity and purpose. The woman who had once cowered behind cardigans and academic propriety now stood before packed auditoriums across Ohio, sharing her story with audiences of educators, law enforcement professionals, and community leaders who were hungry for authentic examples of courage under pressure and the integration of strength with compassion. The speaking engagements had begun modestly, with invitations from neighboring school districts seeking Sarah's insights into anti-bullying strategies and classroom management techniques that went beyond traditional disciplinary approaches. Her Presentations drew on both her educational training and her martial arts background to offer perspectives on conflict resolution that emphasized de-escalation, appropriate use of force, and the psychological dynamics that allowed bullying behavior to flourish in institutional settings. What set her apart from other speakers was her lived experience of facing genuine physical threat while maintaining professional responsibility, creating a credibility that resonated with audiences who dealt with similar challenges in their own work environments. The reputation Sarah had built through these speaking engagements led to an unexpected opportunity that would define the next phase of her career and cement her legacy as someone who had transformed personal trauma into community service. The Ohio Department of Education approached her about developing a statewide curriculum for educator safety, training that would address the growing concerns about violence in schools, while providing teachers with practical skills for protecting themselves and their students. The project represented a chance to influence policy and practice at a level that could impact thousands of educators and hundreds of thousands of students across the state. Working with a team of education specialists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals, Sarah crafted a comprehensive training program that balanced physical safety techniques with psychological understanding of aggression and conflict. The curriculum she developed went far beyond simple self-defense moves to include modules on threat assessment, environmental awareness, verbal de-escalation, and the legal and ethical considerations that governed educator responses to violence. Her unique perspective as someone who possessed extraordinary physical capabilities while maintaining deep commitment to educational values allowed her to address concerns that other experts had struggled to reconcile. The pilot implementation of Sarah's training program at Riverside High School became a model for how schools could address safety concerns without creating an atmosphere of fear or militarization that would undermine the educational mission. Teachers who completed the program reported increased confidence in their ability to handle difficult situations while maintaining focus on their primary responsibility of fostering student learning and development. The training emphasized that physical intervention was always a last resort, but that educators who understood their own capabilities and limitations were better equipped to make sound decisions under pressure. Emma Chun, now a senior and one of Sarah's most dedicated students, had become an unofficial chronicler of the changes that had swept through Riverside High School in the aftermath of the Brandon Mitchell incident. Her college application essays detailed how witnessing her teacher's courage and professionalism under extreme circumstances had inspired her own commitment to standing up for justice and protecting vulnerable people from predatory behavior. Emma's academic achievements and leadership in student government reflected the broader cultural shift that had occurred at the school, where students now felt empowered to challenge inappropriate behavior rather than accepting it as inevitable. The legal resolution of the criminal cases against Brandon Mitchell and his accomplices had created precedents that were being studied by prosecutors and defense attorneys across the region as examples of how the justice system could address teenage violence while maintaining focus on rehabilitation and accountability. Brandon's community service assignment had included working with anti-bullying organizations under Sarah's supervision, creating an uncomfortable but educational dynamic that forced him to confront the human impact of his actions while providing him with models of constructive behavior that he had never encountered in his previous social circles. The mentoring relationship that developed between Sarah and Brandon during his community service hours surprised everyone involved, including Brandon himself, who had expected continued hostility and rejection from the woman he had attacked. Instead, he encountered someone who held him accountable for his actions while simultaneously recognizing his potential for growth and positive contribution to community welfare. Sarah's approach to his rehabilitation drew on her understanding of martial arts philosophy, which emphasized that true strength came from self-control and service to others rather than domination and intimidation. Brandon's transformation from arrogant bully to thoughtful advocate for anti-violence initiatives became one of the most compelling aspects of the broader story, demonstrating that even the most hardened perpetrators could change when confronted with appropriate consequences and positive role models. His testimony at subsequent court cases involving school violence carried particular weight because of his authentic understanding of the motivations and mindset that drove such behavior, combined with his first-hand experience of facing someone who could have destroyed him but chose restraint and education instead. The relationship between Sarah and Mike Rodriguez had evolved from professional friendship to romantic partnership during the months of media attention and community involvement that followed the incident. Mike's unwavering support during Sarah's most vulnerable and confusing period had deepened their connection in ways that neither had anticipated, creating a foundation for intimate relationship built on mutual respect, shared values, and complementary strengths. Their engagement announcement in the local newspaper became another chapter in the ongoing story that had captured community imagination and inspired broader conversations about courage, authenticity, and the power of love to heal trauma. Wedding planning process provided Sarah with opportunities to reconnect with her martial arts community for the first time since her abrupt departure from competition 6 years earlier. Her former sensei, David Park, served as one of the officiants in a ceremony that acknowledged both her educational career and her martial arts heritage, while former training partners and competitors attended as honored guests who celebrated her integration of warrior values with civilian life. The ceremony itself reflected Sarah's journey from hiding to authenticity, with elements that honored her teaching profession, while acknowledging the physical and mental disciplines that had shaped her character. The honeymoon trip to Japan allowed Sarah and Mike to visit traditional dojos and training centers where Sarah could study teaching methods that integrated martial arts philosophy with educational practice. The experience of training with masters who had spent decades perfecting the balance between physical technique and moral development provided Sarah with insights that would influence her continued work in educator training and anti-bullying curriculum development. The conversations with Japanese educators who had successfully implemented character development programs based on martial arts principles offered models for expanding her work beyond safety training to include broader approaches to student development. The return from Japan marked the beginning of Sarah's most ambitious project yet, the establishment of a nonprofit organization dedicated to developing and implementing comprehensive anti-bullying programs that address the root causes of aggressive behavior while providing victims and bystanders with tools for effective response. The organization, which she named the Riverside Foundation in honor of the school where her transformation had begun, attracted funding from educational foundations, corporate sponsors, and individual donors who were inspired by Sarah's story and committed to preventing other students from experiencing the trauma and violence that had once seemed inevitable in many school environments. The first major initiative of the Riverside Foundation was a research study examining the long-term impact of comprehensive anti-bullying programs on school culture, student achievement, and community safety. The study tracked outcomes at dozens of schools across multiple states, comparing traditional disciplinary approaches with the integrated programs that Sarah had developed. The preliminary results showed significant improvements not only in reducing incidents of bullying and violence, but also in enhancing overall school climate, student engagement, and academic performance across all demographic groups. The success of Sarah's work attracted national attention from policymakers and educational leaders who were seeking evidence-based approaches to addressing school violence and creating positive learning environments. Her testimony before congressional committees examining federal education policy helped shape legislation that provided funding for comprehensive anti-bullying programs while establishing standards for educator safety training that reflected her integration of physical preparedness with educational professionalism. The influence she gained through these appearances allowed her to advocate for approaches that addressed systemic issues rather than simply responding to individual incidents after they occurred. The documentary film about Sarah's journey from hidden warrior to educational leader premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to critical acclaim and audience enthusiasm that reflected broader public hunger for authentic stories of personal transformation and social impact. The film, titled Lightning in the Classroom, followed Sarah through a typical day that included teaching her advanced English classes, conducting educator training sessions, working with Brandon on his community service projects, and planning her wedding with Mike. The intimate portrayal of her daily life revealed the complexity of maintaining multiple identities while serving community needs that extended far beyond any single role or profession. The international distribution of the documentary brought Sarah's story to global audiences who were dealing with similar challenges related to school violence, bullying prevention, and the integration of safety concerns with educational missions. Educators from countries as diverse as Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom reached out to learn about her training methods and curriculum development approaches, leading to consulting opportunities that would expand her influence beyond the American educational system. The recognition that her work had global relevance and application provided validation for the years of struggle and growth that had transformed her from victim to advocate. The 5th anniversary of the incident in room 204 was commemorated with a special conference at Riverside High School that brought together educators, law enforcement professionals, researchers, and policymakers from across the country to examine the lessons learned and the ongoing challenges in creating safe, supportive learning environments. Sarah's keynote address reflected on the journey from that moment of crisis to the current state of her work, acknowledging both the personal costs and the community benefits that had resulted from her decision to integrate rather than hide the different aspects of her identity. The conference also featured presentations by students who had been in the classroom during the original incident, including Emma Chen, who was now studying law with a focus on civil rights and anti-discrimination policy. Emma's presentation about the perspective of witnesses to school violence provided insights that had been missing from many previous discussions of bullying prevention, emphasizing the importance of empowering bystanders with tools and confidence for effective intervention. Her academic research on the legal frameworks governing educator responses to violence had become influential in shaping policy discussions at both state and federal levels. Brandon Mitchell's presentation at the same conference represented one of the most powerful moments in the event, as he shared his perspective on the transformation process that had taken him from perpetrator to advocate. His honest discussion of the mindset and social dynamics that had driven his original behavior provided audience members with insights that could inform prevention efforts aimed at potential bullies rather than simply protecting their victims. The fact that he was now pursuing a degree in social work while continuing his volunteer work with anti-bullying organizations demonstrated the possibility for genuine rehabilitation when appropriate interventions were applied with consistency and compassion. The establishment of the Sarah Collins Institute for Educational Safety and Character Development at Ohio State University provided an institutional home for the research and training programs that had grown out of her work with individual schools and districts. The Institute's mission reflected Sarah's integrated approach to education that recognized the connections between physical safety, emotional well-being, and academic achievement in creating environments where all students could reach their full potential. The endowment funding for the Institute came from a combination of government grants, corporate sponsorships, and individual donations that demonstrated broad community support for evidence-based approaches to educational improvement. The research conducted through the Institute was beginning to show measurable impacts on graduation rates, college enrollment, and long-term career outcomes for students who attended schools implementing comprehensive anti-bullying and character development programs. The data suggested that the benefits of creating safe, supportive learning environments extended far beyond preventing individual incidents of violence to include improvements in overall educational effectiveness and student success. These findings were influencing policy discussions about education funding priorities and the allocation of resources for prevention versus intervention strategies. Sarah's evolution from hidden warrior to public advocate had required her to develop new skills in media relations, public speaking, and organizational management that complemented her original expertise in education and martial arts. The woman, who had once been terrified of drawing attention to herself, now commanded audiences of thousands with confidence and authenticity that reflected her comfort with all aspects of her identity. The integration of her various capabilities had created a unique professional profile that allowed her to address complex social problems from multiple perspectives while maintaining credibility with diverse stakeholder groups. The personal costs of her public role had been significant, including the loss of privacy and anonymity that had once provided comfort and security in her daily life. The constant travel for speaking engagements and consulting work had required adjustments in her relationship with Mike and her ongoing responsibilities at Riverside High School, where she maintained a reduced teaching load while continuing to serve as a mentor and resource for students and colleagues. The balance between public service and personal well-being remained an ongoing challenge that required careful attention to boundaries and self-care practices. The impact of Sarah's work was being measured not only in statistical outcomes, but also in the individual stories of students, educators, and community members who had found courage and direction through her example and teachings. Letters from teachers who had successfully intervened in potentially dangerous situations, from students who had found the strength to report bullying, and from parents whose children had benefited from safer school environments, provided personal validation for the professional recognition and public acclaim that her work had received. The legacy that Sarah was building through her integrated approach to education and safety was already influencing a new generation of educators who understood that their responsibilities extended beyond subject matter instruction to include modeling, courage, integrity, and the appropriate use of personal power in service of community welfare. The teacher training programs that incorporated her curriculum were producing graduates who felt prepared to handle the complex challenges of modern education, while maintaining focus on the fundamental mission of helping young people develop their intellectual, emotional, and moral capabilities. As Sarah stood before the latest group of educators attending her training program, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from the hidden room in her apartment, where she had stored the trophies of her martial arts career, to this public platform where she could influence thousands of people who would in turn impact the lives of hundreds of thousands of students. The shy teacher who had once been victimized by teenage bullies had become a confident leader whose work was changing the fundamental assumptions about how schools could address violence while maintaining their educational mission. The final session of each training program always concluded with Sarah's reflection on the most important lesson she had learned through her journey from victim to advocate. She emphasized that true strength was not about the ability to defeat opponents or even to protect oneself from attack, but about the courage to remain true to one's deepest values, even under extreme pressure. The integration of warrior capabilities with educational compassion had taught her that the most powerful response to violence was often the choice to use minimal force while maintaining maximum humanity, creating space for transformation and growth even in the midst of conflict and crisis. The standing ovation that followed her final remarks was not just appreciation for her presentation, but recognition of the broader transformation she represented, the possibility that ordinary people could find extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded nothing less than heroism. As the participants filed out to return to their own schools and communities, They carried with them not only practical skills and knowledge, but also inspiration drawn from someone who had proven that authentic strength came from the integration of all aspects of one's identity in service of purposes larger than personal comfort or security. 10 years had passed since the fateful Tuesday morning in room 204 when Sarah Collins had been forced to confront not only teenage bullies, but the carefully buried aspects of her own identity that she had spent years trying to forget. The woman who now walked through the halls of the newly constructed Sarah Collins Educational Center bore little resemblance to the timid teacher who had once hidden behind cardigans and academic anonymity. Her confident stride, warm smile, and the genuine respect she commanded from students and colleagues alike reflected a journey of integration and authenticity that had transformed not only her own life, but the lives of countless others who had been touched by her story and her work. The educational center that bore her name had become a flagship institution for innovative approaches to character development and safety training that attracted visitors from around the world. The building itself reflected Sarah's philosophy of integrated strength and compassion, with martial arts training spaces adjacent to traditional classrooms, meditation gardens next to research laboratories, and conference facilities designed to accommodate both academic discussions and practical demonstrations. The architecture embodied the principle that true education must address the development of the whole person, including physical capability, emotional intelligence, and moral reasoning. Emma Chun, now Dr. Emma Chun and Director of Research at the center, had spent the morning reviewing data from the latest longitudinal study tracking the outcomes of students who had attended schools, implementing Sarah's comprehensive anti-bullying and character development programs. The results continued to exceed expectations, showing not only dramatic reductions in incidents of violence and harassment, but also significant improvements in academic achievement, college enrollment rates, and long-term career success. The data suggested that creating environments where students felt safe and supported had ripple effects that extended far beyond preventing individual incidents of bullying. The research findings had attracted attention from international organizations seeking to replicate Sarah's successes in educational systems facing similar challenges with youth violence and social dysfunction. Delegations from countries as diverse as South Korea, Brazil, and Sweden had visited the center to study the methodologies and training approaches that had produced such remarkable results. The global interest in Sarah's work reflected growing recognition that effective education required addressing the underlying social and emotional factors that influence student behavior and academic performance. Brandon Mitchell's transformation from high school bully to respected social worker and anti-violence advocate had become one of the most compelling examples of the rehabilitative potential that existed when appropriate interventions were applied with consistency and genuine care. His work with at-risk youth in inner-city schools drew directly on his understanding of the mindset and social dynamics that drove aggressive behavior, combined with the lessons he had learned about accountability and service through his mentoring relationship with Sarah. The young man who had once sought power through intimidation and humiliation now found purpose in helping others recognize their capacity for positive change. The annual conference hosted by the Sarah Collins Educational Center had grown from a regional gathering of educators to an international symposium that brought together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and advocates from dozens of countries. This year's theme, Beyond Prevention, Creating Cultures of Courage and Compassion, reflected the evolution of Sarah's work from reactive responses to bullying toward proactive approaches to character development that empowered individuals and communities to create positive change. The conference sessions ranged from presentations of cutting-edge research to hands-on workshops that allowed participants to experience the training methods firsthand. Sarah's opening keynote address at the conference drew on her recent sabbatical. Years spent studying traditional martial arts philosophies in Asia and their applications to modern educational practice. Her research had taken her to monasteries in Tibet, dojos in Japan, and training centers in Thailand, where she had deepened her understanding of the connections between physical discipline and spiritual development. The insights gained from these experiences were influencing her work on a new curriculum that integrated contemplative practices with safety training and character education. The most moving moment of the conference came during a panel discussion featuring former students from Riverside High School who had been present during the original incident in room 204. Their perspectives on how that experience had shaped their understanding of courage, justice, and personal responsibility provided powerful testimony to the long-term impact of witnessing authentic leadership under extreme pressure. Several panelists had pursued careers in education, law enforcement, or social work specifically because of the inspiration they had drawn from Sarah's example of integrating strength with compassion. Mike Rodriguez, now superintendent of the Millbrook School District, had implemented Sarah's training programs throughout all schools under his supervision, creating a model educational system that other districts sought to emulate. His administrative leadership had been crucial in demonstrating that comprehensive character development programs could be successfully integrated into existing educational structures without compromising academic standards or increasing operational costs. The success of the Millbrook schools had influenced state education policy and federal funding priorities for character education initiatives. The documentary series that followed Sarah's continuing work had won multiple awards and had been translated into dozens of languages for international distribution. The series chronicled not only her personal journey, but also the broader social changes that had resulted from her advocacy in the implementation of her educational programs. The global reach of the documentaries had made Sarah's story a touchstone for discussions about courage, authenticity, and the power of individuals to create positive change in their communities. The Sarah Collins Foundation had grown beyond its original focus on anti-bullying programs to encompass broader initiatives addressing youth development, educator training, and community safety. The Foundation's work now included scholarship programs for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, research grants for innovative educational approaches, and consulting services for organizations seeking to implement character development programs. The expansion reflected Sarah's recognition that preventing violence required addressing the underlying social and economic factors that contributed to aggressive behavior and social dysfunction. The personal costs of Sarah's public role had been balanced by the deep satisfaction she found in work that aligned with her deepest values and utilized all aspects of her capabilities. The integration of her martial arts background with her educational expertise had created opportunities for service that she could never have imagined. During her years of hiding and self-denial, the woman who had once been terrified of revealing her true capabilities now understood that authentic strength came from the courage to be fully oneself, in service of purposes larger than personal comfort or security. The relationship with Mike had provided the emotional foundation that allowed Sarah to take risks and embrace challenges that would have been impossible to face alone. Their partnership reflected the same principles of mutual respect, shared responsibility, and complementary strengths that characterized the educational programs they had developed together. The marriage had produced not only personal happiness, but also professional collaboration that enhanced both of their individual contributions to educational improvement and community development. The legacy of Room 204 had extended far beyond anything that could have been predicted when Brandon Mitchell first decided to humiliate his quiet English teacher. The incident had become a catalyst for changes in educational policy, legal precedents for addressing school violence, and cultural shifts in how communities understood the responsibilities of educators and the potential of all individuals to contribute to positive social change. The transformation of a moment of cruelty into a foundation for widespread improvement reflected the power of choosing courage and authenticity even under the most difficult circumstances. Sarah's evening routine now included time for meditation and reflection in the peaceful garden behind her home, where she could process the day's activities and prepare for the challenges and opportunities that tomorrow would bring. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror bore the confidence and serenity of someone who had found her authentic purpose and was living in alignment with her deepest values. The warrior and the teacher had become one, creating a powerful force for positive change that continued to influence lives and communities around the world. The future held possibilities that Sarah was only beginning to explore, including plans for expanding the educational center into a full university focused on character development and ethical leadership, international partnerships for implementing her programs in developing countries, and research initiatives examining the connections between individual character development and broader social transformation. The shy teacher who had once hidden her true capabilities had become a confident leader whose work was helping to create a more just and compassionate world for future generations. As Sarah closed her laptop and prepared for sleep, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from the hidden room where she had stored her martial arts trophies to this position of influence and service. The most important lesson she had learned was that true strength was not about the ability to defeat opponents, but about the courage to remain true to one's authentic self while serving purposes larger than personal interest. The integration of all aspects of her identity had created possibilities for contribution and impact that exceeded anything she could have achieved by hiding behind partial truths and carefully constructed facades. The story that had begun with teenage cruelty and personal humiliation had become a testament to the transformative power of courage, authenticity, and the choice to use personal strength in service of justice and community welfare. The legacy would continue through the thousands of students, educators, and community leaders who had been influenced by Sarah's example and who would carry forward the principles of integrated strength and compassionate leadership into their own spheres of influence and responsibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.